Raging Bull is remembered as one of the defining achievements of American cinema, and much of its extraordinary power comes from a cast willing to portray people at their most vulnerable, violent, jealous, and self-destructive. At the center is Robert De Niro as Jake LaMotta, the former middleweight boxing champion whose autobiography inspired the film. By 1980, De Niro was already recognized as one of the most committed actors of his generation. His earlier work included Mean Streets, The Godfather Part II, Taxi Driver, 1900, The Last Tycoon, New York, New York, and The Deer Hunter. He had already won an Academy Award for playing the young Vito Corleone in The Godfather Part II, while Taxi Driver had established his ability to disappear into psychologically troubled characters. Jake LaMotta demanded something different. De Niro was not simply playing an aggressive boxer. He had to portray LaMotta across many years, from a muscular professional fighter to an overweight retired nightclub performer. De Niro trained extensively as a boxer and worked closely with the real LaMotta. His preparation became so serious that he developed genuine ability in the ring and participated in several actual boxing matches while preparing for the role. His physical movements were therefore not merely an actor's imitation of a fighter. He learned how a boxer moved, attacked, defended himself, and reacted to punishment. The most famous transformation came when production temporarily stopped so De Niro could gain a large amount of weight to portray the older LaMotta. The transformation was shocking because the audience had already spent much of the film watching him as a powerful athlete. Yet the weight gain was only the most visible part of the performance. De Niro constructed Jake through his breathing, posture, facial expressions, speech patterns, and sudden changes in emotional intensity. His Jake can appear almost calm before exploding into violence. That unpredictability makes the character frightening even when he is outside the boxing ring. The performance earned De Niro the Academy Award for Best Actor and became one of the roles most closely associated with his career. It also strengthened his reputation for extreme preparation and physical transformation. Decades later, actors undergoing dramatic bodily changes for roles would frequently be compared with what De Niro accomplished in Raging Bull. More importantly, the performance demonstrated that a leading actor did not need to make his character sympathetic. Jake could be cruel, paranoid, abusive, and deeply unpleasant, yet De Niro still made him fascinating to watch. Joe Pesci plays Joey LaMotta, Jake's brother and manager, and Raging Bull effectively transformed Pesci's career. Before the film, Pesci was far from being a major Hollywood star. He had performed from childhood and worked in entertainment, including music and comedy, but his screen career had failed to develop significantly. One of his earlier film appearances was in the low-budget crime Picture the Death Collector. Pesci had become discouraged with acting and had largely stepped away from the profession when his performance attracted the attention that eventually brought him into Raging Bull. As Joey, Pesci needed to stand beside the physically imposing De Niro without disappearing from the screen. He accomplished this through extraordinary nervous energy. Joey talks quickly, reacts quickly, and seems permanently prepared for confrontation. At the beginning, he functions as one of the few people capable of controlling Jake. He understands his brother's temperament and attempts to manage both Jake's boxing career and his increasingly unstable personal life. But Joey possesses his own violent instincts, making the brothers believable as members of the same volatile family. The chemistry between De Niro and Pesci became one of the film's greatest strengths. Their conversations often feel less like carefully arranged movie dialogue and more like arguments overheard between actual brothers. They interrupt each other, repeat themselves, become distracted, and allow minor disagreements to become serious confrontations. Their relationship can shift from affection to hostility in seconds. Pesci received an Academy Award nomination for Best Supporting Actor, and the film established him as a formidable character actor. His later collaborations with Scorsese and De Niro would include Goodfellas and Casino. A decade after Raging Bull, Pesci won the Supporting Actor Oscar for Goodfellas. Cathy Moriarty's story was even more remarkable. She was a teenager from the Bronx with virtually no professional film experience, when she was selected to play Vickie LaMotta. Rather than appearing overwhelmed by De Niro, she gives Vickie an unusual combination of confidence, distance, and vulnerability. When Jake first notices her, Vickie appears almost mysterious. As their relationship develops, Moriarty gradually reveals a woman trapped inside Jake's obsessive jealousy and need for control. Moriarty's lack of conventional acting experience arguably contributed to the natural quality of the performance. She does not appear to be trying to compete dramatically with De Niro. Instead, she often remains controlled while Jake becomes increasingly unstable. This contrast makes his behavior even more disturbing. Her performance received an Academy Award nomination for Best Supporting Actress, an extraordinary achievement for a newcomer. Raging Bull immediately established Moriarty as a recognizable talent, although her later film career would be more intermittent than those of De Niro or Pesci. Frank Vincent appears as Salvi, one of the figures connected to Joey and the neighborhood world surrounding the brothers. Like Pesci, Vincent was not yet the familiar screen presence he would eventually become. Raging Bull helped begin a long association with tough Italian-American characters in crime films. He later appeared memorably alongside Pesci and De Niro in Goodfellas and Casino. His presence in Raging Bull, therefore, has additional historical interest because audiences can see the early formation of a group of performers who would later become strongly associated with Scorsese's cinematic world. Nicholas Colasanto plays Tommy Como, the organized crime figure whose influence reaches into Jake's boxing career. Colasanto had already accumulated considerable television experience and had also worked as a director. His understated performance provides a contrast with the explosive personalities around him. When Raging Bull was released in 1980, it did not immediately become the universally celebrated masterpiece that later generations would recognize. Its violence, emotional cruelty, and deeply unsympathetic central character made it difficult viewing for many audiences. Yet, as the years passed, the film grew dramatically in reputation. It came to represent a turning point between the adventurous American filmmaking of the 1970s and a new decade increasingly dominated by larger, more commercially accessible entertainment. Its influence eventually extended far beyond boxing movies, shaping acting, directing, cinematography, editing, popular culture, and the way filmmakers portrayed damaged male characters. One of the most important aspects of its historical significance is that Raging Bull rejected the traditional structure of the inspirational sports film. Boxing stories had often been built around struggle, determination, and eventual triumph. Raging Bull uses boxing almost in reverse. Jake LaMotta can survive extraordinary punishment inside the ring, but he cannot control the destructive impulses governing his private life. Athletic success does not rescue him. Becoming champion does not solve his jealousy, insecurity, or anger. The film, therefore, helped establish the idea that a sports biography could function primarily as a psychological character study rather than a celebration of achievement. This distinction became increasingly influential. Later sports films and biographies could examine addiction, obsession, family conflict, violence, fame, and self-destruction without needing to present their subjects as conventional heroes. Raging Bull demonstrated that audiences could be asked to study a protagonist they might strongly dislike. Jake is fascinating precisely because the film refuses to transform him into a comfortable symbol of redemption. His greatest opponent is ultimately himself, and his inability to recognize that fact gives the story its tragic dimension. The film also became historically important because of its portrayal of masculinity. Jake defines strength through physical dominance, sexual possession, intimidation, and his ability to endure pain. Yet almost everything he associates with strength gradually destroys him. His jealousy poisons his marriage. His aggression damages his relationship with Joey. His inability to communicate vulnerability turns ordinary conversations into interrogations and arguments. Raging Bull, therefore, became an enduring cinematic examination of masculine insecurity decades before discussions about destructive forms of masculinity became widespread in popular culture. Its influence can be seen whenever films portray men whose public power hides profound emotional weakness. Jake became part of a lineage of complicated American antiheroes whose violence is inseparable from insecurity and isolation. Filmmakers did not need to imitate the specific story of a boxer to absorb the lesson. A gangster, soldier, athlete, police officer, musician, businessman, or ordinary family man could be approached with the same uncomfortable psychological intensity. Robert De Niro's physical transformation also became part of popular film culture. His decision to develop a convincing fighter's body and then gain substantial weight to portray the older LaMotta became one of Hollywood's most famous examples of physical commitment to a role. For decades afterward, dramatic transformations by actors were frequently discussed in relation to Raging Bull. The idea of the performer radically changing appearance for authenticity became closely associated with serious acting and awards recognition, even though the deeper achievement of De Niro's performance was psychological rather than simply physical. The boxing sequences had an equally powerful cultural influence. Martin Scorsese did not film the fights as straightforward television coverage. The ring becomes a subjective, almost nightmarish environment. Camera movement, flashes, smoke, slow motion, distorted sound, rapid editing, and exaggerated impacts transform boxing into an expression of Jake's mental state. This approach influenced the visual vocabulary available to later filmmakers depicting combat, competition, and violence. Sports action no longer had to look objective. It could become memory, nightmare, fantasy, or emotional experience. The black and white photography became another defining element. Releasing a major American film in black and white in 1980 was already unusual, particularly at a time when color had long been the commercial standard. The decision gave Raging Bull a visual connection to older photography, news footage, boxing journalism, and post-war cinema. It also separated the movie from contemporary sports entertainment. Instead of appearing like a recreation designed in 1980, much of the film seems to have emerged from Jake LaMotta's own historical period. Raging Bull also strengthened the cultural reputation of the partnership between Scorsese and De Niro. Their earlier collaborations had already produced Mean Streets, Taxi Driver, and New York, New York, but Raging Bull became one of the central works defining their artistic relationship. Their names eventually became inseparable from discussions of major director and actor partnerships. Later collaborations, such as The King of Comedy, Goodfellas, Casino, and The Irishman encouraged audiences to revisit Raging Bull as a key chapter in a remarkable body of work. The movie's influence also extends into parody and reference. Its boxing imagery, particularly the dramatic black and white photography and brutal slow motion, has been echoed in television, advertising, comedy, music videos, and other films. Jake's repeated confrontations with his brother and wife have also become examples of the intense, overlapping conversational style associated with Scorsese's characters. The famous scene in which Jake repeatedly questions Joey about whether he had a relationship with Vickie became especially memorable because an apparently simple conversation transforms into a psychological interrogation. The making of Raging Bull is almost as remarkable as the film itself. What eventually became one of Martin Scorsese's most celebrated achievements began as a project he was not particularly interested in directing. Robert De Niro had become fascinated with Jake LaMotta's autobiography and believed that the boxer's life could become a powerful film. De Niro repeatedly encouraged Scorsese to consider the material, but Scorsese was not a boxing enthusiast and initially struggled to understand what attracted his friend to the story. The breakthrough came when he stopped thinking about Raging Bull as a sports movie and began seeing Jake LaMotta as a man fighting against himself. That interpretation shaped virtually every major creative decision. Scorsese recognized themes that connected with his own interests: guilt, punishment, jealousy, masculinity, violence, and the possibility of redemption. The boxing ring could become more than an athletic arena. It could function as a psychological and almost spiritual space in which Jake's internal conflicts became physical. Once Scorsese approached the story from that perspective, boxing became the visual language rather than the true subject. The screenplay went through substantial development. Martin, who had previously worked with Scorsese, prepared an important version of the script, and Paul Schrader later reworked the material. De Niro and Scorsese also continued reshaping scenes and dialogue during preparation. The objective was not simply to reproduce LaMotta's autobiography. The filmmakers compressed events, reorganized relationships, and constructed a dramatic portrait that would function independently as cinema. The resulting film often feels spontaneous, but considerable work went into creating that apparent naturalism. De Niro's preparation became legendary. He trained closely with Jake LaMotta and learned genuine boxing technique rather than relying entirely on choreography and editing. LaMotta reportedly considered De Niro a surprisingly capable fighter. The actor's training allowed Scorsese to photograph him with unusual confidence because De Niro understood how to move inside the ring. His stance, combinations, defensive movements, and physical reactions could therefore communicate the habits of an experienced professional boxer. The production then faced an extraordinary challenge created by the story's later period. After filming the younger, athletic Jake, production was interrupted so De Niro could transform himself into the retired LaMotta. He gained a large amount of weight to reproduce Jake's heavier appearance. This was not accomplished primarily through prosthetics. When filming resumed, De Niro's altered body changed his entire performance. His breathing was heavier, his movements slower, and his physical presence completely different from the fighter seen earlier. Cathy Moriarty's casting was another crucial behind-the-scenes development. She had almost no film experience when she was chosen to play Vickie. Scorsese needed someone who could plausibly represent the young woman who captures Jake's attention while also possessing enough strength to survive scenes opposite De Niro. Moriarty's distinctive voice, appearance, and self-possession gave the character an authenticity that a more polished performance might have lacked. Her eventual Academy Award nomination made the casting decision appear inspired. Joe Pesci was another unusual discovery. His acting career had largely stalled, and he was not an established Hollywood performer when he was considered for Joey LaMotta. De Niro had noticed Pesci's earlier work, helping bring him to the filmmaker's attention. Pesci's casting proved essential because the relationship between Jake and Joey needed to feel instinctive rather than theatrical. The rapid interruptions, insults, physical gestures, and sudden changes of mood between Pesci and De Niro became fundamental to the film's realism. One of Scorsese's boldest choices was shooting the movie largely in black and white. The decision separated Raging Bull from contemporary sports films and helped evoke the period in which LaMotta fought. Black and white also recalled boxing photography, newspaper images, and older American cinema. Scorsese and cinematographer Michael Chapman could emphasize sweat, smoke, blood, light, and shadow without creating the polished appearance associated with conventional color photography. The boxing scenes required particularly elaborate planning. Scorsese rejected the idea of photographing fights mainly from outside the ropes. He wanted the camera inside the ring with Jake. Each major fight was designed with its own visual identity rather than following a single repeated formula. Camera speed, movement, lens choices, lighting, smoke, and editing changed according to Jake's psychological condition and the dramatic purpose of the sequence. The ring itself could appear different in size from one fight to another. At certain moments, it seems enormous and isolating. Elsewhere, it becomes claustrophobic. Smoke and photographic flashes contribute to an almost dreamlike atmosphere. The audience is not being shown boxing exactly as a spectator sitting in an arena would see it. Instead, the viewer experiences a heightened cinematic interpretation of what the fight means to Jake. Sound was also manipulated during these sequences. Punches were exaggerated, crowd noise could disappear or become distorted, and unexpected effects were introduced to create discomfort. The combination of image and sound made physical impact feel subjective. Scorsese wanted the fights to possess individual emotional rhythms, meaning that the production approached them almost like separate miniature films. Editor Thelma Schoonmaker played a fundamental role in turning this material into the finished movie. Raging Bull became one of the defining achievements of her collaboration with Scorsese. The boxing sequences required precise combinations of normal speed, slow motion, reaction shots, flashes, impacts, and abrupt transitions. Her editing helped make the fights comprehensible while preserving their impressionistic quality. Schoonmaker ultimately won the Academy Award for Best Film Editing. Filming took place in several locations, with Los Angeles used extensively to recreate New York and other settings from LaMotta's life. Production design carefully selected streets, interiors, boxing venues, costumes, and period vehicles helped establish the changing decades. Raging Bull tells the story of Jake LaMotta through a structure that transforms a boxing biography into a tragedy about jealousy, violence, success, and self-destruction. Rather than building toward one triumphant championship victory and ending there, the film follows Jake through different stages of his life. His professional rise occurs alongside the collapse of his personal relationships, creating the central irony of the narrative. Jake can defeat powerful opponents in the ring, but he is unable to control the suspicion and rage that dominate his life outside it. The film begins not with a young boxer, but with an older, overweight Jake in 1964. Alone in a dressing room, he rehearses material for a nightclub performance. The opening immediately tells the audience that the athletic career will eventually disappear. Instead of asking whether Jake becomes champion, the narrative asks how the formidable fighter becomes this lonely entertainer. The story then moves backward to 1941, when Jake is a young middleweight competing in the brutal world of professional boxing. Jake's early fights establish his defining contradiction. He possesses enormous determination and can absorb tremendous punishment, yet his anger is difficult to control. His brother Joey serves as his manager, advisor, and closest companion. Joey understands the boxing business better than Jake and tries to guide his career. Their relationship initially provides stability, although the audience can already see that Jake's temperament threatens everything around him. Jake is married to his first wife, Irma, but their relationship is filled with arguments. His attention soon turns toward Vickie, a young woman he notices around the neighborhood. Jake becomes fascinated by her beauty and apparent independence. He eventually begins a relationship with Vickie, and they marry. For a brief period, the narrative appears to offer Jake the possibility of domestic happiness. Instead, marriage provides another environment in which his insecurity can grow. His jealousy becomes increasingly obsessive. Jake watches the way Vickie speaks to other men and interprets ordinary interactions as evidence of sexual interest. He asks questions repeatedly, looking not for information but confirmation of fears he has already created. The film carefully escalates this behavior. At first, his suspicions can seem almost ridiculous. Gradually, they become frightening because Jake begins treating imagined betrayal as established fact. At the same time, his boxing career progresses. Jake desperately wants a championship opportunity, but the sport is influenced by powerful figures outside the ring. His unwillingness to cooperate with organized crime interests becomes an obstacle. Eventually, he accepts a humiliating compromise and deliberately loses a fight against Billy Fox. The sequence is significant because Jake does not convincingly pretend to be defeated. His disgust is visible, and the result leads to official scrutiny and suspension. This section functions as a major turning point. Jake has compromised the purity he associates with fighting in order to advance his career. Eventually, the sacrifice produces the opportunity he wanted. In 1949, he defeats Marcel Cerdan and becomes middleweight champion. In a conventional sports film, this might be the climax. In Raging Bull, it is deliberately not the emotional conclusion. Winning the championship cannot repair Jake's personality. His relationship with Vickie deteriorates as his paranoia intensifies. A particularly important narrative thread involves Joey, Jake becomes convinced that Vickie may have been involved with other men, and he repeatedly questions his brother. Joey initially treats the accusations as absurd, but Jake cannot let the subject disappear. His questioning becomes a psychological trap in which any answer can be interpreted as evidence. The tension explodes after Jake becomes convinced that Joey and Vickie may have had a sexual relationship. He attacks Vickie and then violently confronts Joey in front of Joey's family. This is one of the narrative's most devastating turning points because Jake destroys the relationship that has supported him throughout his career. Joey has been his manager, protector, brother, and emotional counterweight. Jake's jealousy succeeds in turning his closest ally into another imagined enemy. The film then moves toward the end of Jake's boxing career. His famous rivalry with Sugar Ray Robinson becomes central to one of the most punishing sequences. During their final championship encounter, Jake absorbs a devastating assault. The imagery becomes increasingly nightmarish as Robinson prepares to attack, and Jake seems almost to invite punishment. Jake loses, but he takes strange pride in remaining on his feet. His insistence that Robinson never knocked him down reveals his personal definition of victory. He may lose the championship, but if he can't survive punishment, he believes something essential remains undefeated. This idea connects the boxing narrative directly to Jake's psychology. He understands suffering better than intimacy. Physical punishment is something he can endure and therefore control. Emotional vulnerability is far more threatening. He would rather be beaten in the ring than admit fear, jealousy, or dependence. The narrative repeatedly contrasts his extraordinary capacity for physical endurance with his inability to handle ordinary human relationships. After retirement, the film changes pace and atmosphere. Jake becomes heavier and operates a nightclub. The energetic fighter is replaced by a man performing jokes and introducing entertainment. His decline is not presented through one dramatic catastrophe. Instead, it feels gradual and humiliating. His marriage to Vickie collapses, and his social position becomes increasingly unstable. Jake's nightclub eventually creates legal trouble when he allows an underage girl into the establishment. Desperate for money, he removes valuable stones from his championship belt, destroying the symbolic object representing the greatest achievement of his career. The act captures the tragedy of his decline. Something once representing glory has been reduced to its material value. Raging Bull is far more than the story of a boxer. Beneath its fights, championships, marriages, and arguments lies an intense examination of jealousy, masculinity, guilt, violence, self-punishment, identity, and the possibility of redemption. Martin Scorsese uses Jake LaMotta's life to explore a disturbing contradiction. Jake possesses extraordinary physical strength, yet emotionally he is profoundly fragile. He can survive punishment that would defeat most men, but he cannot tolerate uncertainty, vulnerability, or the possibility that he cannot completely control the people he loves. Jealousy is one of the film's dominant themes. Jake's relationship with Vickie gradually becomes poisoned by suspicions that often have little connection to reality. He studies her expressions, conversations, and interactions with other men as though searching for evidence. The tragedy is that Jake's jealousy creates the betrayal and abandonment he fears. By attempting to control Vickie, he destroys their intimacy. His paranoia eventually spreads to Joey, demonstrating that suspicion has become more powerful than family loyalty. This jealousy is connected to Jake's fear of inadequacy. Although he is physically powerful, he rarely appears emotionally secure. He cannot simply accept that Vickie loves him because that would require trust. Trust means surrendering control, and Jake finds that terrifying. His questioning, therefore, becomes repetitive. He asks the same things in different ways because no answer can permanently satisfy him. The real problem exists within Jake rather than in anything Vickie can say. Masculinity is another central theme. Jake has learned to understand manhood through strength, aggression, sexual possession, and endurance. He rarely possesses the emotional vocabulary necessary to communicate fear or insecurity. Instead, feelings become physical actions. Anger becomes punching. Jealousy becomes intimidation. Humiliation becomes revenge. Even affection can become aggressive. The film repeatedly asks whether Jake's concept of strength is actually another form of weakness. The boxing ring becomes the most important symbol in the movie. On the surface, it is Jake's workplace and a location of his greatest professional achievements. Symbolically, however, it is also the one environment in which his violent instincts have clear rules. Inside the ropes, Jake knows who his opponent is. He knows when the fight begins, what actions are permitted, and what victory means. Outside the ring, relationships contain ambiguity. There are no referees governing jealousy, marriage, brotherhood, or desire. For this reason, Jake often seems more comfortable while being punched than while having an intimate conversation. Physical pain is understandable to him. Emotional uncertainty is not. The ring, therefore, becomes both sanctuary and prison. It gives his aggression a legitimate purpose while reinforcing the identity that prevents him from developing healthier ways of communicating. Blood and physical punishment carry similar symbolic importance. Jake's ability to absorb punishment becomes almost a source of pride. His encounters with Sugar Ray Robinson make this especially clear. Even after suffering tremendous damage, Jake emphasizes that Robinson did not knock him down. Remaining upright becomes more important than winning. Symbolically, Jake measures his worth through endurance. If he can survive suffering, he can convince himself that he has not truly been defeated. The body itself becomes a major symbol. Young Jake's body is disciplined, muscular, and dangerous. It represents professional power and the ability to impose his will physically. The older Jake's body is dramatically different. His weight gain visually communicates the passage of time, but it also represents the disappearance of the identity on which he depended. The fighter's body once gave him status and purpose. When that body changes, Jake must discover who he is without it. Food is subtly connected to this theme. Domestic scenes involving meals frequently become opportunities for conflict. Food represents ordinary family life, but Jake's temperament can turn even mundane situations into confrontations. Later, his heavier body becomes evidence of a life no longer controlled by the discipline of professional boxing. The contrast between the trained fighter and retired nightclub owner makes physical transformation part of the narrative symbolism. Mirrors and performance also carry meaning. Jake spends much of his life constructing an identity for other people. As a boxer, he performs toughness in front of crowds. After retirement, he literally becomes an entertainer, standing before audiences and telling jokes. Near the conclusion, he rehearses in front of a mirror. The fighter who once confronted opponents now confronts his own reflection, although the film deliberately leaves uncertain how completely he understands the person looking back. His recitation of the famous speech from On the Waterfront deepens this idea. Jake borrows the words of Terry Malloy, another fictional boxer associated with regret and lost potential. He uses cinema to express emotions he struggles to articulate himself. The scene symbolizes both self-awareness and limitation. Jake may recognize something about his failures, but he still needs another man's words to describe them. Brotherhood is another major theme. Joey is not simply Jake's manager. He represents loyalty, family, and one of Jake's strongest connections to the world outside himself. Their relationship contains affection, but also aggression. They communicate through insults, jokes, arguments, and physical gestures. When Jake turns his suspicion against Joey, the destruction is particularly significant because paranoia has now conquered one of the strongest bonds in his life. The championship belt becomes a powerful symbol of success and its emptiness. Jake spends years trying to become champion, believing the title will confirm his greatness. Yet once he achieves it, his personal problems remain. Later, when he desperately needs money, he damages the belt to remove its valuable stones. The object that once represented glory is reduced to something that can be broken apart and sold. Professional achievement cannot protect him from personal collapse. The film is also deeply concerned with guilt and punishment. Jake frequently behaves as though he needs to suffer. Raging Bull is one of the most visually distinctive American films of its era. Martin Scorsese and cinematographer Michael Chapman created a style that refuses the polished appearance of a conventional sports biography. Instead, the photography places the audience inside Jake LaMotta's memories, emotions, and violence. The boxing ring becomes an expressionistic arena. Domestic spaces feel increasingly claustrophobic, and the contrast between public spectacle and private misery is communicated as strongly through images as through dialogue. The most immediately recognizable decision was to photograph most of the film in black and white. By 1980, black and white photography was unusual for a major Hollywood production, making the choice especially striking. It gives the story an immediate connection to historical boxing photographs, newspaper images, documentary footage, and films from the period in which LaMotta competed. Rather than looking like actors in a modern recreation of the 1940s and 1950s, the characters sometimes appear as though they genuinely belong to images recovered from those decades. Black and white also serve an artistic purpose beyond historical authenticity. It allows Chapman and Scorsese to emphasize contrast, texture, smoke, sweat, shadows, and light. The fighters' bodies can appear almost sculptural under the powerful overhead illumination of the ring. Blood becomes dark rather than vividly red, preventing the fights from resembling colorful sports entertainment. Violence instead takes on a harsh, abstract quality. Scorsese makes an important exception through the use of color home movie footage. These sequences show family gatherings, marriages, children, and moments of apparent happiness. Their faded appearance resembles genuine private films preserved in a family collection. The contrast is significant. The professional world and Jake's destructive memories exist primarily in dramatic black and white, while fragments of domestic happiness appear in imperfect color. These brief images suggest memories of a normal life that Jake was incapable of preserving. The boxing scenes represent the film's greatest visual achievement. Scorsese did not want the camera to behave like a spectator watching from a seat outside the ropes. Instead, the camera frequently enters the ring. It moves beside Jake, approaches his opponents, follows punches, and sometimes seems to occupy the fighter's psychological perspective. The viewer does not simply observe a boxing match. The viewer experiences Jake's subjective understanding of combat. Each fight was designed differently. This prevents the boxing sequences from becoming repetitive and allows their visual language to reflect Jake's changing circumstances. Some fights move rapidly, while others stretch moments through slow motion. The ring can appear spacious in one sequence and suffocatingly small in another. Opponents may seem physically realistic at one moment and almost monstrous at another. The environment changes according to dramatic emotion rather than remaining objectively consistent. Slow motion is particularly important. Scorsese uses it not merely to display athletic technique, but to alter perception. A fighter approaching Jake can suddenly seem terrifying. A gesture from Vickie can acquire enormous significance when Jake watches her from across a room. By slowing time, the film shows how Jake observes the world. Small movements become evidence in his mind, and ordinary interactions can take on threatening meaning. Camera movement is equally expressive. During the fights, tracking shots and rapid approaches create physical excitement, but some of the most memorable movements are controlled and ceremonial. Before Jake's championship fight, the camera follows him toward the ring with a sense of destiny. His entrance becomes almost ritualistic. The visual grandeur suggests that he is approaching the achievement he has spent years pursuing, making the emptiness that follows his success more tragic. The famous final fight with Sugar Ray Robinson pushes this expressionism to an extreme. The ring appears increasingly nightmarish. Smoke fills the background, flashes erupt around the fighters, and Robinson's preparation for an attack is presented with terrifying anticipation. Changes in speed and framing transform a sporting contest into something resembling an execution. Jake's willingness to remain exposed to punishment becomes visually connected to his deeper need to suffer. Framing outside the ring is often much less dynamic. Apartments, kitchens, dressing rooms, clubs, and neighborhood locations frequently contain characters within tight spaces. Jake's domestic world can feel physically crowded even when relatively few people occupy the frame. This creates visual pressure. The walls surrounding him seem incapable of containing his aggression. Scorsese also uses distance to express jealousy. Jake frequently watches Vickie from across rooms, swimming pools, clubs, or social gatherings. The camera adopts the role of observer, emphasizing his obsessive attention to her behavior. A glance that another person might ignore becomes important because Jake notices it. Visual perspective, therefore, helps the audience understand how paranoia transforms ordinary social behavior into imagined evidence. Mirrors become increasingly important as Jake ages. Earlier in the film, he defines himself through opponents and relationships. Near the conclusion, the older Jake stands before a mirror rehearsing his nightclub routine. The composition reduces the entire conflict of the film to one man facing his own image. There is no boxer on the opposite side of the ring and no family member to accuse. His reflection has become his final opponent and audience. The film's visual treatment of physical transformation is equally effective. De Niro's change from trained athlete to overweight entertainer is not hidden through careful framing. Scorsese emphasizes it. The older Jake occupies space differently. His movements have changed, his clothes sit differently on his body, and his face carries the consequences of age and excess. The transformation provides an immediate visual representation of time passing and identity disappearing. The sound of Raging Bull is as carefully constructed as its famous black and white imagery. Martin Scorsese does not treat music and sound merely as background accompaniment. They become part of Jake LaMotta's emotional world, creating an extraordinary contrast between elegance and brutality. Classical music can transform the boxing ring into a tragic stage, while punches, breathing, camera flashes, crowd noise, silence, and deliberately manipulated effects make the fights feel less like realistic sports coverage and more like fragments of memory or nightmare. The musical identity of the film is established immediately through its opening sequence. Jake appears alone inside a boxing ring, moving slowly as smoke surrounds him. Instead of aggressive, sporting music, Scorsese uses the intermezzo from Pietro Mascagni's opera Cavalleria Rusticana. The music is graceful, melancholy, and deeply emotional. Combined with slow motion, it transforms the boxer into an isolated figure performing almost like a dancer. Before the audience knows anything about Jake, the soundtrack suggests tragedy. This choice is crucial because it changes expectations. A conventional boxing film might introduce its hero with energetic music emphasizing strength and competition. Raging Bull introduces Jake with music that seems to mourn him. The audience is effectively being shown the memory of a man whose greatest battles have already happened. The intermezzo became so strongly associated with Raging Bull that hearing the piece can immediately evoke images of De Niro moving alone beneath the lights. Scorsese's use of existing classical music rather than a conventional original dramatic score also gives the film a timeless quality. Selections connected with Italian opera reinforce the cultural environment surrounding Jake, while adding emotional dimensions that the character himself struggles to communicate. Jake rarely explains his deepest feelings. Music can express sadness, longing, beauty, and regret even when he responds to those emotions with aggression. The contrast between the soundtrack and Jake's personality is one of the film's greatest achievements. Jake's world is frequently ugly. He shouts, threatens, attacks, and humiliates people. Yet Scorsese surrounds parts of that world with beautiful music. The film therefore refuses to reduce Jake to simple brutality. Beauty exists around him even when he cannot recognize or preserve it. The boxing sequences employ a radically different audio language. Sound designer Frank Warner helped construct effects that make every major fight distinctive. Punches are exaggerated rather than presented with documentary realism. Their impacts can sound enormous, almost unnatural. The intention is psychological. The viewer is experiencing the violence as Jake experiences it, where every blow can become an event of terrifying intensity. Scorsese and his collaborators used an unusual variety of effects to create these sounds. The soundtrack incorporates noises that audiences would not normally associate consciously with boxing. Animalistic effects and heavily manipulated impacts contribute to the impression that the ring is becoming a primitive, dangerous environment. Because these sounds are integrated into the action rather than highlighted separately, viewers may feel their effect without identifying their origin. Breathing is another essential component. During moments of exhaustion or anticipation, Jake's breathing can become more important than the crowd. The audience is pulled away from the public spectacle and toward the fighter's body. Boxing becomes intensely intimate. We hear fatigue, fear, concentration, and physical damage in ways that a spectator sitting far from the ring could never experience. Crowd noise is constantly manipulated. At some moments, the spectators roar with overwhelming intensity. At others, their presence becomes strangely distant or disappears. These changes allow Scorsese to control psychological perspective. When Jake becomes completely focused on an opponent, the outside world can seem irrelevant. The ring becomes a private space despite thousands of people watching. Silence is therefore one of the movie's most powerful sound effects. Removing expected noise creates tension because viewers instinctively understand that something has changed. A brief reduction in crowd sound before an attack can make the following punch more shocking. The soundtrack repeatedly alternates between overload and emptiness, mirroring Jake's unstable emotional experience. Camera flashes also possess an important sonic presence. Photographers surrounding the ring are not simply visual decoration. Their flashes and mechanical activity reinforce the sense that Jake's suffering is being transformed into public entertainment. Violence is watched, photographed, and remembered. The ring is simultaneously a workplace, theater, battlefield, and media spectacle. The Sugar Ray Robinson sequences provide some of the clearest examples of subjective sound design. As Robinson prepares to attack, realistic ambience gives way to something more frightening and abstract. Sound stretches anticipation. The audience knows violence is coming before the blow arrives. When it finally does, the impact feels enormous because the soundtrack has created psychological preparation for it. Outside the ring, sound becomes more naturalistic, but remains carefully controlled. Domestic scenes are filled with voices, kitchen noises, street ambience, clubs, and crowded conversations. These ordinary sounds establish a recognizable working-class environment. Yet, Jake can disrupt that normality instantly. A conversation becomes louder, voices overlap, and an ordinary room turns into a battlefield. Overlapping dialogue is especially important to the film's realism. Jake and Joey frequently interrupt each other rather than waiting for perfectly organized lines. Arguments contain repetition, unfinished thoughts, insults, and sudden changes in volume. The soundtrack allows these conversations to feel spontaneous. The audience sometimes experiences the same difficulty separating words and emotions that would exist during an actual family argument. When Raging Bull arrived in theaters in 1980, its reputation was not immediately as secure as it is today. The film received significant critical admiration, but it also divided viewers because Martin Scorsese had created something deliberately uncomfortable. Audiences expecting an inspirational boxing drama encountered a violent psychological portrait centered on a protagonist who could be cruel, paranoid, abusive, and difficult to sympathize with. Over time, however, critical opinion increasingly moved toward extraordinary admiration, and Raging Bull eventually became regarded as one of the greatest American films ever made. The initial response reflected the movie's challenging nature. Critics could easily recognize the technical accomplishment of the filmmaking, particularly Robert De Niro's performance, Michael Chapman's black and white cinematography, Thelma Schoonmaker's editing, and Scorsese's direction. Yet admiration for craftsmanship did not necessarily translate into affection for the film. Jake LaMotta spends much of the story destroying relationships, interrogating his wife, fighting with his brother, and expressing himself through violence. Some viewers found spending so much time with him exhausting. Commercially, Raging Bull was not comparable to the major crowd-pleasing successes of its period. Its subject matter, black and white photography, severe violence, and emotionally unpleasant domestic scenes limited its appeal as mainstream entertainment. This was especially significant at a time when Hollywood was increasingly recognizing the enormous commercial potential of accessible blockbusters. Raging Bull belonged to a darker tradition of character-driven filmmaking that had flourished during the previous decade. Robert De Niro's performance quickly emerged as the most universally celebrated aspect. His transformation into Jake was impossible to ignore. Critics admired not only the dramatic weight Gain used for the older LaMotta, but also the physical discipline required to portray Jake during his boxing career. De Niro had learned the movements of a genuine fighter, allowing the boxing scenes to avoid the awkward physicality sometimes found when actors portray professional athletes. The Academy Awards provided major recognition. Raging Bull received 8 nominations, including Best Picture and Best Director for Scorsese. De Niro was nominated for Best Actor, Joe Pesci for Best Supporting Actor, and Cathy Moriarty for Best Supporting Actress. The film also received nominations connected with cinematography, sound, and editing. De Niro won the Academy Award for Best Actor, while Thelma Schoonmaker won for Best Film Editing. De Niro's victory became one of the defining achievements of his career. He had previously won Supporting Actor for The Godfather Part 2, but Raging Bull confirmed his status as one of the leading dramatic performers of his generation. His portrayal of Jake eventually became a standard against which physically and psychologically transformative performances were measured. Schoonmaker's editing victory was equally significant artistically. The fights depend on constantly changing rhythms, moving between rapid violence, suspended slow motion, reaction shots, photographic flashes, and abrupt impacts. The editing does not merely organize footage. It determines how the audience experiences Jake's violence. Her work helped establish one of the most celebrated editor and director partnerships in modern cinema. One of the most discussed results of the award season was Scorsese's failure to win Best Director. Robert Redford received the award for Ordinary People, which also won Best Picture. At the time, Ordinary People was itself a highly respected drama and major critical success. As Raging Bull's reputation grew over subsequent decades, however, Scorsese's loss increasingly appeared on retrospective lists of notable Academy Award decisions. This later discussion demonstrates how dramatically perceptions of the film changed. The violence also generated controversy. Raging Bull contains brutal boxing, but the domestic violence is arguably more disturbing because it lacks the rules of sport. Jake's treatment of Vickie and his attack on Joey forced the audience to confront the ugliness of his behavior without the excitement provided by competition. The film does not present these actions as heroic, yet their intensity made the viewing experience difficult. The language and portrayal of its social environment also contributed to its harsh tone. Characters insult each other constantly. Conversations become confrontations, and masculine aggression dominates many interactions. Some critics questioned whether the movie provided enough distance from Jake's behavior, while defenders argued that its refusal to offer comforting moral explanations was precisely what made the portrait powerful. As the decade progressed, reassessment became increasingly enthusiastic. Raging Bull began appearing prominently in surveys of the best films of the 1980s. Critics who had initially viewed it as an impressive but punishing experience increasingly described its severity as one of its strengths. The movie had not become easier. Critical expectations had shifted around it. Its reputation was strengthened further by preservation and institutional recognition. In 1990, Raging Bull was selected for preservation in the United States National Film Registry, identifying it as a work of major cultural, historical, or aesthetic importance. Its inclusion only a decade after release demonstrated how quickly it had become regarded as a significant piece of American film history. The legacy of Raging Bull extends far beyond its reputation as a great boxing movie. Since its release in 1980, Martin Scorsese's film has become a reference point for directors, actors, cinematographers, editors, and screenwriters attempting to create psychologically complex character studies. Its influence can be found in sports dramas, biographical films, crime stories, and movies centered on destructive men. More importantly, it demonstrated that a film about athletic achievement did not have to celebrate victory. Raging Bull could show a champion reaching the top while simultaneously destroying almost everything meaningful in his life. One of its greatest influences was on the sports film itself. Traditional boxing stories frequently build toward a decisive fight in which victory symbolizes personal triumph. Raging Bull deliberately weakens that formula. Jake LaMotta, becoming middleweight champion, does not solve his problems, and the championship is not even positioned as the final dramatic climax. His true conflict exists outside the ring. This approach helped establish a model for later sports films in which competition provides the setting for a deeper examination of obsession, identity, family, ambition, or self-destruction. The film's influence is especially visible in boxing cinema. Later filmmakers had to confront the extraordinary standard established by Scorsese's fight sequences. Instead of photographing boxing primarily from the perspective of spectators, Raging Bull places the camera inside the ring and manipulates speed, sound, smoke, framing, and editing to make combat subjective. A fight can represent fear, punishment, rage, humiliation, or psychological collapse. Boxing films that followed could adopt different styles, but ignoring the visual achievement of Raging Bull became increasingly difficult. Its impact on acting was equally substantial. Robert De Niro's preparation for Jake LaMotta became one of the most famous examples of physical transformation in screen history. He developed the body and movement of a trained boxer and later gained considerable weight to portray the retired Jake. This became a cultural benchmark for what audiences began to call transformational acting. Whenever performers dramatically altered their bodies for prestigious roles, comparisons with De Niro frequently followed. Yet focusing entirely on the weight transformation can obscure the deeper influence of the performance. De Niro demonstrated how an actor could dominate a film while portraying someone audiences might strongly dislike. Jake does not need to be made conventionally sympathetic. His insecurity, jealousy, humor, vulnerability, cruelty, and physical confidence coexist. Later films centered on antiheroes benefited from the principle that understanding a protagonist does not require approving of that protagonist. The movie also changed the careers of Joe Pesci and Cathy Moriarty. Pesci's performance as Joey effectively revived his acting career and eventually helped establish the screen personality that would become famous in later Scorsese collaborations. His explosive combination of humor, loyalty, irritation, and violence can be seen as an early foundation for performances in Goodfellas and Casino. Raging Bull, therefore, indirectly contributed to one of the most recognizable acting ensembles in modern American crime cinema. The film strengthened the artistic partnership between Scorsese and editor Thelma Schoonmaker as well. Her Academy Award-winning work became a model for expressive editing. The fights do not simply maintain continuity. Their rhythm changes according to Jake's emotional state. Slow motion can suddenly become rapid violence. Silence can precede an explosive impact. Images can seem documentary in one instant and almost hallucinatory in the next. Editors and filmmakers studying how montage can communicate psychology continue to find Raging Bull invaluable. Michael Chapman's cinematography produced an equally lasting visual legacy. The decision to use black and white prevented the film from resembling most contemporary sports dramas and connected it with historical photography in memory. Its high-contrast images, smoke-filled arenas, photographic flashes, and carefully controlled camera movement became iconic. The image of Jake alone in the ring beneath the lights remains one of the most recognizable visual compositions associated with Scorsese's career. The opening sequence has been particularly influential. Jake moves in slow motion while the intermezzo from Cavalleria Rusticana plays over the image. The combination of classical music and physical aggression creates a feeling of tragedy before the narrative has even begun. Numerous filmmakers, television programs, advertisements, and visual artists have borrowed the broader technique of combining elegant music with violent or physically intense imagery. Raging Bull was not the first film to use such contrast, but it became one of its most celebrated examples. Its legacy also lies in the development of Scorsese's recurring cinematic themes. Raging Bull stands alongside Taxi Driver, Goodfellas, Casino, and later works as part of his continuing interest in men who confuse power with control. Jake's violence is not presented merely as exciting behavior. It is connected to insecurity, guilt, desire, social identity, and self-punishment. This psychological approach would remain central to Scorsese's examination of gangsters, criminals, celebrities, and other obsessive personalities. Raging Bull also became essential to discussions of the new Hollywood generation. Although released in 1980, it carries many qualities associated with the director-driven American cinema of the 1970s. Moral ambiguity, difficult protagonists, stylistic experimentation, adult subject matter, and resistance to conventional happy endings. Because Hollywood was moving toward increasingly franchise-oriented and high-concept entertainment, the film later came to represent both the culmination and the fading of a particular filmmaking era. Its institutional legacy has been enormous. Critical polls and organizations repeatedly placed Raging Bull among the greatest American films. Its selection for preservation in the National Film Registry confirmed its cultural and historical importance. Film schools regularly analyze its editing, cinematography, sound, performances, and direction. For students of filmmaking, individual boxing sequences can function almost as lessons in how image and sound can manipulate subjective experience. The audience experience of Raging Bull has always been complicated because the film deliberately denies viewers the comfort normally provided by a heroic protagonist. Jake LaMotta is talented, determined, physically courageous, and capable of extraordinary endurance. Yet he is also jealous, controlling, violent, and deeply destructive. Audiences are therefore placed in an unusual position. They can admire what Jake accomplishes in the boxing ring while becoming increasingly disturbed by the man he reveals himself to be outside it. That contradiction has shaped how different generations have interpreted the film. For audiences encountering Raging Bull in 1980, the experience could be particularly challenging. Boxing films were already associated with familiar ideas of struggle and triumph, and Rocky had recently transformed the genre into enormously popular entertainment. Raging Bull offered something radically different. Jake's rise through professional boxing does not lead toward emotional fulfillment. Becoming champion cannot repair his marriage, eliminate his insecurity, or save his relationship with Joey. Success actually makes the emptiness surrounding him more visible. Some viewers initially found the film emotionally cold or difficult because Jake provides so few opportunities for uncomplicated identification. The audience is not encouraged to excuse his behavior simply because he is the protagonist. Instead, viewers are required to remain close to a man who repeatedly causes suffering. This creates one of the movie's most important emotional questions. Can we understand someone without forgiving him? Different audiences have answered that question differently. Some see Jake primarily as a tragic figure, a man whose inability to control jealousy destroys the happiness he desperately wants. Others respond more strongly to Vickie and Joey, seeing the story as an examination of the damage created when one person's insecurity dominates an entire family. These interpretations are not necessarily contradictory. The film allows Jake to be both a suffering individual and the cause of enormous suffering in others. Male viewers have often found the film's examination of pride especially recognizable. Jake rarely admits weakness directly. He expresses vulnerability through aggression because physical confrontation is the language he understands best. Fear of losing Vickie becomes an accusation. Fear of humiliation becomes violence. Fear of betrayal becomes surveillance and interrogation. For audiences familiar with environments in which emotional openness was discouraged, Jake can represent an extreme version of recognizable behavior. This aspect has become increasingly important for later generations. Modern audiences often discuss the film in terms of destructive masculinity, emotional repression, possessiveness, and abusive relationships. These terms may be more prominent today than they were in mainstream discussions surrounding the original release, but the behavior was always present in the film. Changing social conversations have therefore given viewers additional language for interpreting material that Scorsese presented decades earlier. Vickie's position within the story has similarly attracted greater attention over time. Younger Jake initially sees her almost as an idealized image. She is beautiful, distant, and desirable. Once they are together, however, his desire becomes inseparable from fear that another man could take her away. Contemporary viewers may be especially sensitive to the way his jealousy gradually restricts her freedom. His supposed love becomes a justification for suspicion and control. Audiences also frequently respond to Joey as an emotional anchor. His relationship with Jake contains humor, loyalty, frustration, and violence, making it one of the film's most believable human connections. Joey understands his brother better than almost anyone, but even that understanding has limits. When Jake finally turns his paranoia against him, viewers often experience the destruction of their relationship as more painful than any defeat in the boxing ring. The fights themselves produce another complicated audience response. They are visually beautiful, but physically horrifying. Scorsese makes the viewer feel the excitement of combat while refusing to hide its brutality. A punch can be thrilling as a piece of filmmaking and repulsive as an act of physical damage. This creates discomfort because spectators become aware of their own fascination with violence. Jake's willingness to absorb punishment has inspired many interpretations. Some viewers see it as pride. Others interpret it as self-hatred or a need for punishment. His insistence that Sugar Ray Robinson never knocked him down suggests that survival matters more to him than victory. As long as Jake remains standing, he can preserve his identity as someone who cannot be completely defeated. That attitude can initially appear admirable. Perseverance is normally celebrated. Raging Bull gradually complicates the idea by asking whether endurance has value when a person refuses to change. Jake survives punches, professional decline, divorce, prison, and isolation. Yet survival alone does not restore what he has destroyed. The audience is forced to distinguish resilience from growth. The prison scene is therefore one of the moments that resonates most strongly with viewers. Jake has finally reached a place where there is no opponent available to absorb his anger. He strikes the wall and collapses emotionally. For much of the movie, he has projected his fear onto Vickie, Joey, rival boxers, and other men. In the cell, the physical wall offers no explanation and no argument. The enemy has become unmistakably internal. Audiences differ over whether this moment represents genuine self-recognition. Some interpret it as the beginning of Jake understanding what he has done. Others see only temporary despair. The film refuses to settle the question, which is one reason discussion continues long after the ending. A more conventional drama might provide a clear scene of confession and transformation. Raging Bull offers fragments of awareness instead. The later meeting between Jake and Joey creates similar ambiguity. Jake wants affection and reconciliation, but Joey cannot erase the past simply because his brother now wants contact. Many viewers find this painfully realistic. Relationships damaged over years are not repaired through one embrace. The scene recognizes both Jake's desire to reconnect and Joey's right to remain emotionally guarded. Raging Bull is built around character transformation rather than conventional sporting triumph. Jake LaMotta changes physically, professionally, and socially throughout the film, yet his emotional development is much more complicated. His journey is not a simple movement from weakness to wisdom. Instead, Martin Scorsese presents a man who repeatedly receives opportunities to understand himself, but continues returning to jealousy, aggression, and self-punishment. The supporting characters develop largely in response to Jake, gradually changing the way they interact with a man whose behavior becomes increasingly destructive. When a younger Jake is introduced, he already possesses the qualities that will define both his success and his downfall. He is aggressive, stubborn, suspicious, and extraordinarily determined. In boxing, these characteristics make him dangerous. He can absorb punishment and continue advancing. He refuses to accept physical domination easily, and his pride gives him tremendous competitive energy. Outside the ring, however, those same qualities become destructive because Jake treats emotional relationships as contests that must be controlled. His central motivation is not simply becoming champion. Jake desperately wants certainty. He wants to know that he is respected, that his wife desires only him, that his brother is loyal, and that nobody can humiliate him. Because absolute certainty is impossible in human relationships, Jake constantly searches for threats. A casual conversation can become evidence of betrayal. A glance can become an accusation. His insecurity, therefore, creates the very instability he is attempting to prevent. Vickie's arrival reveals this weakness clearly. Initially, Jake is fascinated by her beauty and composure. She appears independent and somewhat mysterious, qualities that attract him precisely because he cannot completely understand her. Once they become a couple, those same qualities begin to frighten him. Jake wants possession to eliminate uncertainty, but marriage cannot control another person's thoughts. His affection gradually becomes inseparable from interrogation. Jake's professional development creates an important contrast. He rises through boxing, compromises himself by deliberately losing a fight, receives his championship opportunity, and finally becomes middleweight champion. Professionally, he has achieved the identity he wanted. Emotionally, however, he has barely progressed. The title cannot remove his insecurity. His greatest external success, therefore, exposes his internal failure. Joey begins as Jake's closest ally and stabilizing influence. He understands his brother's temper and frequently acts as translator between Jake and the outside world. Joey handles business, offers advice, and tries to protect Jake from his own impulses. Their conversations reveal genuine affection beneath constant insults. Joey can challenge Jake in ways other characters cannot because their bond was established long before fame and professional success. Yet, Joey has his own aggressive personality. When he believes someone has disrespected Jake or Vickie, he can respond violently. This similarity between the brothers is important. Joey is not presented as Jake's moral opposite. He belongs to the same masculine environment and understands many of the same codes of loyalty and reputation. The difference is that Joey generally possesses greater practical awareness and emotional control. His character arc involves recognizing that loyalty cannot save someone determined to destroy trust. Jake eventually directs his suspicions toward Joey, imagining that his brother may have had a relationship with Vickie. Once Jake violently attacks him, their bond is fundamentally broken. Joey's later distance is therefore a form of self-protection. He develops by establishing a boundary Jake was never willing to respect. Vickie's arc is equally important. When Jake first sees her, the film partly presents her through his fascinated perspective. She seems almost like an image rather than a fully accessible person. As the story continues, her individuality becomes clearer. She jokes, argues, socializes, becomes a wife and mother, and increasingly resists Jake's attempts to control her. Her development is largely a movement from attraction and domestic partnership toward emotional survival. Jake repeatedly demands reassurance, but reassurance never works because his suspicion does not originate in her behavior. Eventually, Vickie understands that she cannot prove innocence to someone committed to imagining guilt. Her departure, therefore, represents one of the few decisive forms of change in the story. Unlike Jake, she eventually acts to escape the cycle. Jake's relationship with Sugar Ray Robinson operates differently because Robinson functions less as a conventional developed supporting character and more as Jake's professional mirror. Robinson represents excellence Jake cannot simply intimidate. Their rivalry reveals Jake's unusual relationship with punishment. Even when Robinson defeats him, Jake finds psychological victory in remaining upright. He would rather absorb terrible damage than accept the identity of a defeated man. This attitude becomes central to Jake's arc throughout his life. He confuses survival with success. If he remains standing, he believes he has won something. But the later stages of the film expose the weakness of this philosophy. Jake survives the end of boxing, the destruction of his marriage, separation from Joey, legal trouble, and imprisonment. Survival does not mean that he has preserved what mattered. His physical transformation after retirement externalizes this crisis of identity. The younger Jake's disciplined body is the instrument through which he understands himself. The older Jake can no longer depend on that identity. He becomes a nightclub owner and performer, replacing boxing audiences with entertainment audiences. His need to perform remains, but the source of attention has changed. The championship belt becomes important during this decline. Once the symbol of everything Jake struggled to achieve, it eventually becomes an object he damages while desperately seeking money. His relationship with the belt reflects his own development. The glory that once defined him cannot protect him from consequences created outside the ring. The jail sequence represents the lowest point of his character journey. The costume, makeup, and production design of Raging Bull play an essential role in convincing the audience that Jake LaMotta's life is unfolding across several decades. Martin Scorsese wanted the film to feel less like a polished recreation of the past and more like a collection of memories recovered from another era. Clothing, apartments, boxing arenas, nightclubs, streets, furniture, hairstyles, and physical transformations all contribute to this effect. The design never overwhelms the characters. Instead, it quietly establishes social class, changing fortunes, personality, and the passage of time. Jake's boxing clothing is naturally among the simplest costumes in the film, yet that simplicity is important. Inside the ring, elaborate social distinctions disappear. Jake is reduced to trunks, gloves, shoes, robe, and body. His physical condition becomes his costume. The muscular young fighter represents discipline, aggression, and professional identity without requiring decorative clothing. His body tells the audience who he is before he speaks. The robes and boxing equipment also contribute to the ritualistic quality of the fights. When Jake approaches the ring, clothing helps separate preparation from combat. The robe belongs to the public entrance and presentation of the fighter. Once it is removed, Jake enters the stripped-down environment in which he feels most comfortable. There are fewer ambiguities in the ring than in his marriage or family life. His costume reflects that simplicity. Outside boxing, Jake's clothing communicates his changing status. The younger Jake generally wears practical period suits, shirts, jackets, and casual clothing appropriate to his working-class neighborhood environment. As his career develops, his appearance becomes more prosperous. Better clothing accompanies professional success, but the improvement in material circumstances never produces emotional sophistication. Jake may look increasingly successful while continuing to behave with the same insecurity that defined him earlier. This contrast becomes even stronger after retirement. Robert De Niro's famous weight gain radically changes how costumes function on his body. The older Jake wears clothing associated with a nightclub owner and entertainer, but the effect is deliberately different from the athletic figure of his youth. Shirts, jackets, and trousers now emphasize his heavier shape. Costume and physical transformation work together to demonstrate that the identity of the professional fighter has disappeared. Makeup supports the passage of time without replacing De Niro's physical performance. Facial changes, hair, weight, and age gradually turn Jake into a different version of himself. The transformation is effective because it is not presented as a single theatrical reveal. The audience has spent so much time studying the younger fighter's face and body that every difference in the older Jake becomes meaningful. Vickie's costumes serve a different purpose. When Jake first notices her, her appearance contributes strongly to his fascination. Her clothing, light hair, makeup, and controlled manner make her stand apart within the neighborhood environment. She is introduced partly through Jake's gaze, and costume helps create the almost idealized image he constructs around her. As Vickie becomes Jake's wife, her wardrobe changes with age and social position. She appears increasingly established and sophisticated, reflecting the couple's improved circumstances. Yet this elegance also feeds Jake's insecurity. The more confidently Vickie presents herself socially, the more she notices how other men respond to her. Costume therefore participates indirectly in the jealousy driving the narrative. The film's hairstyles and makeup are similarly important in establishing period. Rather than treating the 1940s and 1950s as a collection of exaggerated historical references, the design allows period detail to exist naturally around the characters. Hair, cosmetics, suits, dresses, ties, coats, and accessories establish the decades without constantly demanding attention. Joe Pesci's Joey is dressed in a manner consistent with his position between family life, boxing management, and neighborhood business. His suits and shirts give him a sharper social appearance than Jake sometimes possesses, reinforcing Joey's role as the brother more capable of negotiating with other people. He moves between gyms, restaurants, clubs, homes, and meetings, and his clothing helps him belong convincingly in each environment. Production design performs the same function on a larger scale. Jake's early domestic spaces feel modest, crowded, and practical. Kitchens and apartments are not glamorous environments. Their limited physical space becomes especially effective during arguments. When Jake becomes angry, rooms seem smaller because family members cannot easily escape his presence. The design therefore contributes directly to the tension. The neighborhood locations create a strong sense of community. Streets, restaurants, swimming areas, clubs, and apartment buildings suggest a world in which people repeatedly encounter one another. Privacy is limited. Everyone appears connected through family, friendship, business, or reputation. This helps explain why Jake becomes obsessed with what other people may be saying or doing. His social world feels physically close. The boxing arenas are among the most heavily stylized environments. Rather than presenting every venue identically, the production allows the ring and surrounding space to change according to the emotional requirements of individual fights. Smoke, ropes, lights, spectators, photographers, and darkness transform the arena into something more psychological than realistic. The ring sometimes feels enormous, and at other times almost impossibly confined. Photographers positioned around the ropes add another layer of period authenticity. Their equipment and flashes recall classic images from the golden age of boxing journalism. Combined with black and white cinematography, these details make certain frames resemble actual sports photographs from LaMotta's career. The contrast between domestic interiors and boxing arenas is fundamental. At home, Jake is surrounded by furniture, walls, family members, food, and ordinary objects. In the ring, almost everything unnecessary disappears. There are ropes, lights, an opponent, officials, and spectators. Visually, boxing offers Jake the clarity that his private life lacks. The nightclub environments mark another stage in his decline. The screenplay of Raging Bull is one of the major reasons the film feels so immediate and uncomfortable. Written by Paul Schrader and Martin, and further shaped through the creative involvement of Martin Scorsese and Robert De Niro, the script transforms Jake LaMotta's life into something much more complicated than a conventional sports biography. Instead of relying heavily on explanatory dialogue, the film allows personality to emerge through arguments, interruptions, accusations, jokes, repetitions, and uncomfortable silences. Characters rarely explain themselves clearly because Jake's greatest problem is precisely his inability to communicate what he actually feels. Much of the dialogue sounds deceptively ordinary. People discuss food, boxing, relationships, neighborhood gossip, money, and other men and women. Yet seemingly harmless conversations can become threatening within seconds. This instability is fundamental to the screenplay. The audience learns that almost any subject can activate Jake's insecurity. Because of that uncertainty, even quiet conversations carry tension. The early domestic scenes establish this technique immediately. Jake's arguments with his first wife are not constructed like elegant dramatic speeches. They are repetitive and frustrating. Small disagreements become disproportionately serious because Jake treats resistance as a challenge. The writing demonstrates his personality through behavior rather than providing a speech explaining that he is angry or insecure. His conversations with Joey are even more important. The brothers frequently interrupt each other, repeat questions, insult one another, and shift between affection and hostility. Their dialogue has a rhythm associated with people who have known each other for their entire lives. They do not need to explain every reference because they share history. This gives their scenes a sense of authenticity that carefully polished exposition could have destroyed. Joe Pesci's rapid delivery complements De Niro's heavier, more suspicious rhythm. Joey often attempts to move a conversation forward, while Jake becomes trapped on one particular detail. This difference creates both humor and tension. Joey may believe a question has already been answered, but Jake continues returning to it because the factual answer is not what he actually wants. He is seeking emotional certainty that dialogue cannot provide. The conversations concerning Vickie demonstrate this brilliantly. Jake repeatedly questions what she has said, whom she has spoken with, and what other men might think about her. His questions function like interrogations. The more answers he receives, the less satisfied he becomes. The screenplay, therefore, turns repetition into characterization. Jake does not move toward understanding through conversation. He circles around the same fear until it becomes an accusation. One of the film's most memorable exchanges occurs when Jake questions Joey about Vickie. The scene begins with the appearance of brotherly conversation, but gradually becomes dangerous. Jake repeatedly pushes toward the possibility that Joey himself may have been involved with her. Joey becomes increasingly irritated because he recognizes the insanity behind the questioning. The tension comes not from a sudden revelation, but from the audience realizing where Jake's mind is heading before he says it directly. Humor plays an important role throughout these scenes. Raging Bull is remembered as a dark and violent film, but much of its dialogue can be extremely funny. The humor comes from personality, irritation, exaggeration, and the absurdity of arguments. Joey's reactions to Jake are particularly important because he often responds to his brother's irrational behavior with disbelief. These moments make the characters feel human while also increasing the impact when comedy suddenly becomes violence. The script also avoids excessive explanation of the boxing world. Organized crime influence, matchmaking, championship opportunities, and professional relationships are introduced through conversations that assume the characters already understand their environment. This allows the audience to learn gradually rather than through artificial speeches designed solely to provide information. Jake's decision to participate in a fixed fight is particularly revealing. The screenplay does not transform the event into a long moral debate. Jake's humiliation is communicated through the situation and his behavior. His inability to convincingly pretend that he has been defeated says more about his pride than an explanatory monologue could. Another major strength is the difference between public and private language. In the boxing world, Jake's communication can be direct and aggressive. At home, he tries to apply the same mentality to emotions that cannot be controlled through force. After retirement, language becomes his profession. The former fighter stands on nightclub stages telling jokes and performing routines. This creates an important evolution. A man once defined by his fists is eventually forced to depend on words. Yet the screenplay refuses to suggest that becoming a performer automatically means Jake has learned genuine communication. His nightclub material can sound rehearsed because it is rehearsed. He has learned how to speak to an audience without necessarily learning how to express himself honestly to the people closest to him. This idea reaches its fullest expression near the ending. Jake rehearses the famous speech from On the Waterfront, in which Terry Malloy confronts the pain of what his life might have been. The reference is especially appropriate because Terry was also a boxer, although his story and personality differ greatly from Jake's. By borrowing this speech, Jake finds language for regret through another character. The choice is deliberately ambiguous. On one level, the speech suggests growing self-awareness. Jake can finally contemplate wasted opportunities and failure. On another level, he is still performing. The words are not his own. The screenplay therefore refuses to turn the scene into a simple confession. The audience must decide whether Jake has genuinely understood himself or merely discovered a more sophisticated way to present himself. Silence is almost as important as spoken dialogue. The marketing of Raging Bull reflected the unusual challenge presented by the film itself. Released in 1980, it arrived at a moment when Hollywood was becoming increasingly interested in easily recognizable concepts, major stars, spectacular entertainment, and films capable of attracting broad audiences. Raging Bull had Robert De Niro, an acclaimed director in Martin Scorsese, and the familiar subject of professional boxing, but it was not an uplifting sports adventure. Its protagonist was violent and self-destructive. The photography was largely black and white, and the story became increasingly concerned with domestic collapse rather than championship glory. The campaign, therefore, had to sell the power and prestige of the film without pretending that Jake LaMotta's story was a conventional heroic journey. One of its greatest marketing advantages was De Niro. By this stage, he had already become associated with serious American filmmaking through movies such as The Godfather Part II, Taxi Driver, and The Deer Hunter. His presence signaled that Raging Bull was intended as a major dramatic performance rather than simply another boxing picture. Scorsese's reputation provided another important element. His collaborations with De Niro had already produced Mean Streets, Taxi Driver, and New York, New York. Viewers familiar with those films could expect intensity, urban realism, morally complicated characters, and stylistic ambition. Marketing Raging Bull around the reunion of Scorsese and De Niro, therefore, helped position it as an important filmmaker-driven project. The theatrical poster became one of the film's most recognizable promotional images. Rather than emphasizing a triumphant boxer raising his arms after victory, the imagery presented De Niro's Jake as an isolated figure associated with the ring. This matched the emotional character of the movie. Boxing was present, but triumph was not the dominant message. The visual identity suggested seriousness, loneliness, and conflict. The title itself was an exceptionally effective promotional tool. Raging Bull is short, aggressive, memorable, and immediately connected to Jake LaMotta's reputation. Even viewers unfamiliar with LaMotta could understand the basic image. A bull suggests power, stubbornness, uncontrolled aggression, and the willingness to charge directly into danger. Those qualities describe both Jake's boxing style and the personality that damages his private life. Trailers could naturally emphasize the film's most accessible material: De Niro's performance, the boxing sequences, Jake's turbulent relationships, and Scorsese's visual style. The fights provided dramatic images that could attract viewers interested in sports and action, while the domestic confrontations made clear that the film contained a darker personal story. This combination distinguished Raging Bull from inspirational boxing dramas. The black and white photography became an important part of the promotional identity. Normally, releasing a major film without conventional color photography might have been considered commercially difficult. In this case, the unusual appearance helped communicate prestige. Images from a movie resembled historical boxing photography and gave posters, advertisements, and publicity stills a visual identity immediately distinguishable from most other films released around the same period. De Niro's transformation also generated enormous publicity value. Stories about his preparation emphasized the seriousness of the production. He had trained extensively to portray LaMotta as a convincing professional fighter and then dramatically changed his body for the later scenes. Public discussion of that transformation helped create the impression that audiences would be witnessing an unusually committed performance. The involvement of the real Jake LaMotta provided another promotional connection. Raging Bull was based on his memoir and presented events associated with a genuine former middleweight champion. This allowed publicity to appeal not only to film audiences, but also to boxing enthusiasts familiar with LaMotta, Sugar Ray Robinson, and the sport's history. The biographical foundation gave the film an additional layer of fascination. Unlike modern releases, Raging Bull had no social media campaign. There were no official online accounts releasing character clips, viral videos, countdown posts, or behind-the-scenes material directly to millions of viewers. Promotion depended on theatrical trailers, newspaper advertising, television appearances, magazine coverage, interviews, reviews, posters, publicity photographs, and word of mouth. Critical discussion, therefore, played an especially important role in shaping the film's public identity. Awards campaigning also became part of its extended promotion. Raging Bull received 8 Academy Award nominations, including Best Picture, Best Director, Best Actor, Best Supporting Actor, and Best Supporting Actress. De Niro's eventual Best Actor victory and Thelma's Schoonmaker's Award for editing provided powerful confirmation of the film's artistic importance. Even viewers who had not seen it during its initial theatrical run could become aware of it through awards coverage. The campaign faced an unavoidable difficulty. However, the film itself was challenging to recommend as uncomplicated entertainment. Jake is not an easy hero, and the movie contains disturbing domestic violence alongside brutal boxing. Word of mouth could therefore be divided. Some viewers emerged overwhelmed by the filmmaking, while others found the experience exhausting or unpleasant. Marketing could bring audiences to the theater, but it could not transform the film into the inspirational sports story some might have expected. Commercially, Raging Bull was therefore never positioned to behave like the largest mainstream hits of its era. Its eventual cultural success developed gradually. Critical reassessment, awards recognition, television exposure, home video, restoration, repertory screenings, film education, and repeated inclusion on greatest film lists effectively became a second marketing campaign that continued for decades. Home video was particularly important to the film's long-term visibility. Once viewers could discover or revisit Raging Bull outside theaters, its reputation became less dependent on the conditions of its original release. Raging Bull occupies an unusual position within both the boxing genre and Martin Scorsese's career because it resembles several familiar kinds of film while refusing to behave exactly like any of them. It is a sports biography, a family drama, a study of masculine violence, and a rise and fall story. Comparing it with Rocky, On the Waterfront, The Champ, Taxi Driver, and later Scorsese films such as Goodfellas reveals why Raging Bull remains so distinctive. Where many films use struggle as a path toward victory or redemption, Raging Bull repeatedly questions whether success has any value when the person achieving it cannot control himself. The most obvious comparison is Rocky. Released 4 years before Raging Bull, Rocky helped redefine the modern boxing film and became an enormous popular success. Both movies focus on working-class fighters, physical punishment, relationships, pride, and the desire to prove personal worth. Yet their emotional philosophies are almost opposites. Rocky Balboa becomes stronger through love and human connection. Jake LaMotta gradually destroys those connections because he interprets vulnerability as weakness. Rocky's boxing provides a route towards self-respect. The important achievement is not simply defeating an opponent, but proving that Rocky can endure and become more than people expected. Jake also values endurance, but Raging Bull turns that quality into something troubling. Jake can withstand terrible punishment, yet his ability to remain standing does not teach him how to live. Physical resilience becomes almost useless when separated from emotional development. The visual styles are also dramatically different. Rocky generally allows boxing to retain recognizable sporting geography. Raging Bull transforms the ring into an expressionistic, psychological environment. Scorsese changes camera speed, sound, apparent space, smoke, lighting, and editing according to Jake's emotional condition. The viewer is not merely watching a fight. The viewer is experiencing Jake's internal relationship with violence. A comparison with On the Waterfront is especially important because Raging Bull directly acknowledges that film near its conclusion. Marlon Brando's Terry Malloy is a former boxer who famously reflects on lost opportunity and the possibility that his life might have been different. The older Jake performs part of Terry's speech while rehearsing before a mirror. The reference connects two major American films concerned with boxers: regret, masculinity, and compromise potential. Yet Terry and Jake reach regret through different paths. Terry's opportunities have been damaged partly by corrupt forces surrounding him, while Jake repeatedly participates in the destruction of his own happiness. Jake also faces corruption in professional boxing, including the pressure surrounding his championship ambitions. But Raging Bull refuses to let external forces explain his deepest failures. His marriage and relationship with Joey collapse primarily because of his own behavior. The comparison makes the final quotation deliberately ironic. Jake borrows the language of another cinematic fighter to express feelings he has struggled to articulate himself. He may recognize something of his own life in Terry, but the audience understands that Jake cannot simply claim the same explanation. His greatest opponent was never a manager, criminal organization, rival fighter, or missed opportunity. It was himself. Earlier boxing dramas, such as The Champ, often used the sport to generate sympathy and emotional sacrifice. Raging Bull is far less interested in making its fighter lovable. Jake can be funny and vulnerable, but the film repeatedly forces viewers to witness behavior that damages sympathy. This refusal to sentimentalize him became one of the movie's major contributions to the genre. Raging Bull can also be compared with Scorsese and De Niro's Taxi Driver. Travis Bickle and Jake LaMotta are very different men, yet both are isolated protagonists whose distorted perceptions affect the way they interpret other people. Travis views society through alienation and obsession. Jake views relationships through jealousy and suspicion. Both men struggle to express vulnerability directly, and violence becomes a language through which internal confusion reaches the external world. The visual strategies differ, however. Taxi Driver uses the nighttime color, neon, rain, streets, and subjective atmosphere of New York to enter Travis's mind. Raging Bull uses black and white photography, boxing imagery, slow motion, smoke, photographic flashes, and changing sound to enter Jake's. In both cases, Scorsese does not simply tell audiences that a character is psychologically unstable. The filmmaking itself begins to reflect that instability. Goodfellas provides another revealing comparison. Both films examine Italian-American environments, masculine loyalty, violence, family relationships, and men whose identities are connected to tightly organized social worlds. Joe Pesci's presence makes the relationship particularly noticeable. Yet, Goodfellas possesses a faster, more seductive narrative energy. Henry Hill is attracted to the gangster lifestyle because it offers status, money, excitement, and belonging. The audience is allowed to feel some of that attraction before the lifestyle becomes increasingly destructive. Raging Bull is less seductive. Jake's boxing success can be exhilarating, but Scorsese constantly connects physical glory with suffering. The championship does not produce a sustained period of triumph. Even when Jake possesses fame, a family, and professional achievement, his internal conflict remains unchanged. The rise and fall therefore occur simultaneously rather than as completely separate sections. Goodfellas also explains its world through Henry's narration, giving audiences a guide to gangster culture. Raging Bull provides no equivalent continuous narrator. Viewers must observe Jake and interpret him through behavior. This creates greater emotional distance and makes the film more ambiguous. The later Casino offers another variation on self-destruction. Like Jake, its central characters can possess professional expertise while failing catastrophically in personal relationships.